Hello, everyone. This is Peg Hanna. Welcome to the afternoon NJPACT Transportation Stakeholdering session, and welcome back to those of you who were on this morning's session and are brave enough to spend a whole day with us. I know that's quite a lot. We have just started recording this session. I am going to start off the next 20 minutes or so giving some background explanation of how we got to this point, what we're going to cover today, as well as some ground rules for the discussion. As you can see, the bulk of the day will be spent discussing the potential strategies that we're going to consider related to ocean-going vessels and hovercraft. Jeff Cantor of Bureau of Mobile Sources will be leading that discussion. We've allocated 2 hours, which would bring us to a closing time of 3:30. That's about an hour earlier than originally envisioned. So I just wanted to let you all know that we are happy to go longer than 2 hours if there is sufficient interest and comments. I know we have a relatively large group participating today. I think we have about 65 people signed up. So if we need until 4:30, we will certainly take until 4:30. But if we're done early and comments are slowing down, we'll go ahead and end early. I wanted to say 2 things at the outset. One, I wanted to start off with an apology for some problems on our end from an IT perspective in the invitations getting to the proper recipients. We were using a dedicated sort of generic email box to send all of the invites out. And I've heard from multiple people as recently as this morning that the invitations didn't necessarily reach the intended recipient for whatever reason. So I'm going to take responsibility for that and apologize to those of you who got the invitation extremely late or perhaps didn't get it at all. My understanding is that there was a lot of teamwork involved by certain key people, including Beth Rooney from Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, to make sure that the right people were aware of this afternoon's conversation. The second thing I wanted to say, or to emphasize really, is that the concepts we're talking about today and the concepts we talked about this morning as well as last week are very preliminary. At this point, we have no confirmed plans to move forward with any of them. And my commitment to you is that we will not move forward with any of them until we're convinced that we've had sufficient stakeholder input, that we understand the implications, we understand the state of technology, and we are assured that these are cost-effective, reasonable, strategic, and efficient strategies to move forward with in order to achieve our climate change goals. So I'm going to take down the agenda, bear with me for a second, and start my presentation. Monica, can you see my screen now, the presentation?
No, I cannot.
No, okay. Let's try it again. Okay, how about now?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Now.
Okay, thank you. So welcome again, everyone. This is the formal part of our session today. So today we're talking about reducing CO2 as well as short-lived climate pollutants. As I said, this meeting is being recorded. The recording, as well as the presentations that are being shown today, will be posted on the NJPACT website later today or tomorrow. In addition, all of the comments that we receive by the deadline will also be posted on the NJPACT website so that everything is easily accessible and you can go back and refer to it if you weren't able to participate in today's session or missed pieces of it. Just some ground rules. Everybody is muted by our administrative staff. If you'd like to ask a question, use the raise hand function. For all of you that are not using Apple computers, there should be a toolbox towards the middle of your screen, and there's a hand icon. Click that once to raise your hand. Click it a second time to lower your hand. You can also type a question in the chat box. If you are calling in as opposed to participating through the web link, you can press *6 to mute yourself and *6 again to unmute yourself. We will be moderating the hand raising as well as the chat box, and we'll call on you in the order that you raised your hand or typed your question. When we call on you, please unmute yourself, and you are welcome to turn your video on while you're speaking if you'd like, but we'd ask that you keep your video off and make sure you are muted if you are not being called on to speak. So for those of you that heard this morning and last week, I apologize that you're going to hear it again. Hopefully it's exactly the same, maybe not verbatim, but the same message. So this all started primarily with the Energy Master Plan that New Jersey released in January. That Energy Master Plan established a framework for meeting our clean energy and climate goals, which are essentially 100% clean energy and widespread electrification by 2050. The Energy Master Plan covered all energy sources and listed strategies that were very diverse and comprehensive. In addition to the Energy Master Plan released in January, the governor also signed an executive order in January that directed DEP specifically to take regulatory actions to reduce short-lived climate pollutants as well as CO2. The executive order also directed us to start a greenhouse gas monitoring and reporting rule, which is already underway. The development of that is already underway. And then we had an initial stakeholdering session in February. Ken Ratzman, our assistant director for our permitting program, led that session. And that day focused on reductions from existing stationary sources. We received significant comments during that stakeholder session as well as afterwards. A lot of the comments indicated that we should be focusing on transportation as well as stationary sources, and that we should be looking at other climate pollutants such as black carbon in addition to CO2. So that brings us here today. We've held 3 additional stakeholdering sessions since February. The first one was on September 3rd. Ken Ratzman led that as well, and that expanded the suite of possible strategies that we were considering for stationary sources. The second one was transportation related, and that was held last week. We covered California's advanced clean truck rules, their zero emission fleet rules, their low NOx omnibus rules, as well as their drayage truck rules. We also talked about including medium duty trucks in our statewide inspection program. Today is the last of the 3 stakeholdering sessions in round 2. This morning we talked about cargo handling equipment and ground support equipment, and this afternoon now we'll be talking about ocean-going vessels and hovercraft. As I said, the Energy Master Plan is really the starting point for this discussion. The Energy Master Plan proposed a suite of strategies that will hopefully help us achieve the Global Warming Response Act goal of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases below our 2006 baseline by 2050. As I said, there are 4 different transportation stakeholdering sessions that were held, with this session being the final of the 4. In addition to what the Energy Master Plan requires us to do, the strategies that we're pursuing are also science-based or data-based. We know that the majority of greenhouse gases in the state are generated from the transportation sector, both on-road and non-road. And we also know that ozone precursors like NOx as well as PM 2.5 are still extremely important considerations, and those don't go away just because of our focus on climate change. In fact, many of the strategies that we're pursuing, such as electrification, are going to get reductions of not just greenhouse gases, but also NOx and PM 2.5. You can see from these pie charts that the majority of NOx emissions in the state are coming from the transportation sector, according to our latest inventory, which was 2017. For particulate matter, it's about 25% of our inventory. So even though that's a little bit smaller than the NOx, we know that PM 2.5 has toxics attached, the particles have toxics attached to them, and they have a particularly harmful effect in the urban areas and the already overburdened communities. We've all heard DEP's mantra on the health effects from diesel emissions, but I think the last bullet bears repeating. When we analyze the national air toxics data and look at the projected concentrations for New Jersey, we see that diesel emissions are presenting a higher cancer risk than any other air toxic emitted in New Jersey, which to me is very compelling. We also know that if we aim towards a zero carbon transportation future, that will provide particular benefits to EJ communities. We also know that black carbon is a highly warming, short-lived climate pollutant, and there will be direct health savings associated with reducing emissions of black carbon. As I said, the Energy Master Plan lays out strategies to achieve 100% clean energy by 2050 and makes some significant assumptions, particularly with regard to electrification of the medium and heavy-duty trucking sector. There's an entire chapter of the Energy Master Plan dedicated to transportation, so I'd encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested. The strategies laid out in there range from reducing vehicle miles traveled to making communities more walkable, making public transportation more accessible, and electrifying the transportation sector. I'd also note that responsibility for implementing the transportation strategies in the Energy Master Plan goes beyond just DEP. Our sister agencies, New Jersey DOT, Treasury, BPU, EDA, just to name a few, all play a role in implementing those strategies and working to achieve our 2050 goal. In addition to the strategies that we're talking about today and that we talked about last week during the stakeholder session, I wanted to highlight for you a few other initiatives that are already underway that are all hopefully getting us towards our 2050 goal. So a few months ago, Governor Murphy, along with 14 other governors from states and jurisdictions, signed on to a regional MOU that commits everybody to work together to stakeholder and develop an action plan that will get us to 30% of new truck and bus sales electric by 2030, increasing to 100% by 2050. We will be doing stakeholdering on this in the coming months, so look forward to getting invitations on that as well. I like to show this picture because it demonstrates the diversity of interest in electrification issues. You can see not just the Northeast, but also the West Coast, and then Colorado and Hawaii have signed on to work towards this goal. Importantly, you can see down on the bottom left, all of these states and jurisdictions, the 15 states and jurisdictions, account for nearly 40% of the goods moved by truck. We have multiple sources of funding, all of which are being funneled towards transportation electrification. The Volkswagen settlement is probably the most highly publicized one, and that allocated $72.2 million for transportation electrification in New Jersey, including over $10 million for associated EV charging infrastructure. We just closed our second and probably final project solicitation. We received over $100 million worth of proposals for about $37 million left in funding. Those proposals ranged from electrifying ground support equipment to electrifying school buses and transit buses. We also have settlement money. Fiat and Bosch are just two examples of some settlement money that we have. We have a variety of other federal grants as well as settlement supplemental environmental projects that are all being channeled towards funding the applications that we received under Volkswagen. And then finally, the RGGI Strategic Funding Plan was released in June. That sets the path for BPU, EDA, and DEP to spend the proceeds, which are approximately $80 million a year, primarily on transportation electrification. There is a carve out to do carbon sequestration for our tidal areas and marshes, but the majority of that money will also go towards transportation electrification. And last but not least, the electric vehicle law was also signed in January 2020. It was a very busy start to the year. It focused largely on electrifying the light-duty sector. It also required the state to lead by example and electrify 25% of its fleet by 2025, and that number increases by 2035. And it requires us to establish goals for medium and heavy-duty electrification, as well as the associated charging infrastructure. So that goal setting will be synchronized and linked with the regional action plan and the regional MOU that we're developing with the other states in the region. So look forward to more information on that. With that, I'm going to stop screen sharing and turn it over to Jeff Cantor, who is going to lead the rest of the discussion. As a reminder, please keep your videos off unless you're speaking, and please keep your phones muted. If you have questions, raise your hand or type in the chat box. We also have someone monitoring the chat box for technical issues, so if you are having technical problems, feel free to type that in the chat box as well, and someone will get back to you. Jeff, we can see your screen, so you're all set.
Excellent. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Technology is working, at least for the moment. Yes. Well, yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us, either for the first time or yet again today, or perhaps for the third or fourth time in the last week and a half as we've been doing all of these sessions. For those who were here this morning, I'm going to run this somewhat similarly to the way Melissa did. We sort of have two slightly dissimilar topics, ocean-going vessels and hovercraft. And we're going to go through the presentation on ocean-going vessels. We'll pause, have a chance to take some questions, get some discussion going. When that peters out, we will then move on to the second and admittedly significantly shorter part of the presentation on hovercraft. And then once again, have a chance for some questions and discussion operating as Peg described at the beginning. For both types of vessels, we're going to start out by looking at what the emissions are, how they can be controlled, what the inventory looks like as best as we understand it. And then we're going to look a little bit at some of the things that CARB is doing, California Air Resources Board is doing, their regulations, both current, past and present, and the future work that they are working on, and how we might be able to base some of our work going forward on what they are doing. And then, of course, as I said, open things up for questions and discussions. And that's truly the most important part of what we're doing here. There are a lot of moving parts to all of these, and probably, certainly for myself, and I think for many of us, especially on this topic, it's one that we haven't dealt with a tremendous amount. So there are a lot of things that we're still trying to gather information on, and all of you on the call today, we greatly appreciate the help and assistance that we know we're going to get from you in filling in the blanks and correcting some of the information that we have. So let's start with looking at what some of the regulatory concepts are. California is developing some updated regulations to expand the use of shore power and emission capture systems, both of which I'm going to go into in a bit more detail in a few minutes, for ocean-going vessels that are at berth, loading, unloading, doing those sorts of activities. They also have existing rules requiring the use of low sulfur fuels within 24 nautical miles of shore. And yes, these are similar to other rules in place from other entities, but there are some slight differences. And conceptually, we could potentially adopt by reference some of those activities, some of those regulations that California is doing. Again, both some of the past things and some of their new work that they are talking about at the moment. So their current regulations for ocean-going vessels were adopted in 2007 and implemented beginning in 2014. They applied to auxiliary engines on container ships and reefer ships, and it was phased in. They started out with a 50% power reduction in 2014 and a final 80% power reduction this year, 2020. I don't recall exactly when during the year. They have the option of using shore power to accomplish that, or by using emission capture systems to capture and process the emissions coming from those auxiliary engines. Now that those regulations have, in essence, been fully implemented, CARB is going back as we speak and looking at what can they do as the next step. And they're looking at, as we understand it from what they have shared with us and shared publicly, they are looking to expand upon those existing regulations by doing a few things. One, expanding to include some additional classes of ships, the ro-ro, the roll-on, roll-off ships, and also tanker vessels. They're expanding the areas of responsibility, so more players in the port scenario have some responsibility, not just the vessels, but also the ports, the port terminals, and some of the third-party providers. This is a challenge, as I'm sure most of you on the call probably know better than we do, that requires a team effort and multiple players. It can't be just the ships, it can't be just the terminals. Everyone needs to step up and provide different parts of that puzzle to make things work. They've changed their compliance, or looking at changing the compliance methodology to go from an annual average to just looking specifically at each visit. Specific to California, they are including more actual facilities. Their original rule listed a few port facilities by name. They're now expanding that list. They're also going beyond just the auxiliary engines on the ships, but also including boiler emissions, at least from tanker ships. And they're changing the way the length of time that the ship is visiting the port is calculated. Not to get into the details, but it will end up encompassing a longer period of time, or more of that actual time. So why are we concerned about the ships and about the mobile source contributions? Peg covered this before, but as you can see, mobile sources are a significant, if not majority, portion of pretty much every part of our inventory. And if we look more specifically at the pollution contributions at the port, and specifically at the ocean-going vessels, which is the lighter orange pie piece that I've pulled out here in each of these sections. The ocean-going vessels are, again, well, certainly for NOx, they are the largest portion of that pie. They are a very close second when it comes to VOCs, and they're a full quarter of the PM emissions. Part of our main focus, or really our main focus of all of these sessions here, is looking at greenhouse gases. And when we turn to the greenhouse gas contributions at the port, again, we see that ocean-going vessels are a full 25% of port activities. I should point out here that these statistics all come thanks to our friends at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. They do a fantastic job of inventorying their equipment, its use, its operation, and the emissions that it produces, and making that data readily available to us and publicly. So all of these numbers come from their most recent inventory done in 2018. Ocean-going vessels obviously serve a very vital role in our global commerce. 80% of our global commerce, 80% of our global trade, 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 80% when they come into port, either to deliver goods, to receive goods for export. They generally operate their auxiliary engines and at times also their boilers at berth and at anchor. And these generate all of the usual combustion emissions we would expect: NOx, PM, specifically diesel particulate matter, some greenhouse gases, of course, and black carbon, which is a short-lived greenhouse gas that we are also looking at some level here today. Different types of vessels that visit the port include container ships, refrigerated cargo or reefers, cruise ships, the roll-on, roll-off I mentioned, the ro-ro ships, tankers and various bulk and general cargo. The port facilities in the northern part of the state, centered around Newark and Elizabeth, handle all of these different types, although primarily container ships. And they stay in the port anywhere from a little less than a day to over 5 days. It really varies quite widely. Again, the data that I'm going through here comes from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. They operate many of the port facilities in and around Newark, but there are others that are outside of their jurisdiction. The Port Authority receives roughly 3,000 ships per year, mix of various types. The container ships are, as I mentioned a moment ago, the most common. Tanker ships tend to be the least common for their facilities. And on average, any one ship will visit the port about 10 times per year, but that can vary quite a bit from some ships that are making regular runs and might be seen 20, 25 times a year to others that maybe only once or twice a year. Length of stay varies as little as 18 to 24 hours for auto carriers and upwards of 100+ hours for bulk ships. They are a lot harder, more difficult to, or time consuming to load and unload. The other facilities in and around New York Harbor, we've been told, see approximately another 1,000+ ships. Obviously, there are also port facilities in the southern end of the state, centered around Camden and Gloucester City. We do not, at the moment, have as accurate data on the numbers of ships and their mix that are calling on those ports. Part of that is the Coast Guard does not have the same level of tracking system down there. But they're dealing with many of the same issues. It's my understanding that those ports deal with more tank and bulk cargo and a lot less on the container cargo. But again, the ships are still there and their emissions issues are quite similar. So what are the emission control technologies that are out there? Well, the two main ones are shore power, which in a very simplistic sense is just run a really, really giant extension cord and run the ship off of electric power available on shore. Obviously, it's a good deal more complicated than that, but that's the basic concept. The other option is the capture and control systems I mentioned at the beginning. Here, a bonnet or some sort of capture device is fitted over the exhaust stack or stacks of the auxiliary engines and or boilers that will be operating while the ship is at berth. And those gases, those emissions, are sucked down into a system that processes them, filters them, neutralizes them as best as possible. Those systems can have two subsets within them. One is shore-based equipment that would be on land and hook up to the ship from that side. And the other, which is what you see in the picture here, would be floating systems, water-based systems on a barge or some other service boat that would do the same. Cost for shore power that we've been able to uncover first requires a retrofit of each ship that would participate of around $1 million a piece, and then the shore power installation seems to run around $7 million per berth. Varies quite a bit, of course, to the size of the pier, the size of the types of ships serviced. There are a lot of varying factors there. The emissions capture equipment can be land or barge-based, as I mentioned. Land-based systems, we've seen averages in the $3.5 to $4 million range, and the water-based systems a little under $6 million. Those figures do cover some of the annual operation and maintenance costs, which vary a little bit between the wharf, the land-based, and the barge-based. In general, it appears that shore power has, they each have some advantages and disadvantages one would expect in any situation like this. Shore power will eliminate nearly all of the local emissions from the ship. It also has the potential to have significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions because we're replacing that local combustion with electrical generation, which, especially here in New Jersey, is often a good deal cleaner mix of fuels. It is more expensive. It does require the retrofit to the ship itself, as I mentioned before, and it requires very significant power availability at the berth. Emissions capture really just reduces the local ship emissions. It doesn't have much potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, from what we've seen from some of the California data, it may actually increase greenhouse gas emissions due to the fuels needed that are burned on the barge to run the equipment that's doing the scrubber work. They do have lower installation costs and can serve pretty much any ship that comes in to the port without any prior retrofits. Does have the emissions capture equipment does have some significant space issues, and special thanks to Beth Ann Rooney and a few others from the port a week or so ago in helping us understand some of the constraints and where you can park those barges and where you can't. So that is much appreciated. The potential for emissions benefits. This table here comes from California's experience. Our results here in New Jersey would be similar, but I must stress they would definitely vary because we have a different inventory of ships calling. They stay for different lengths of time, and the mix of the use of potential for the use of shore power versus the use of one of the various scrubber capture systems would be different. California actually did see, as I mentioned, a net increase in greenhouse gas emissions in a few specific locations. That doesn't show up in this chart here, but that's simply because it's averaging the entire program statewide. Quick look at how the emissions control and capture and control systems, the scrubbers, can work either in a closed loop or open loop. This is showing the barge mounted type of operation, but the land-based ones would be somewhat similar. It does pose an interesting question of exactly where and how the sludge and other pollutants that are collected and concentrated, how they are disposed of. And something that we would love some additional information on. We have not been able to have the chance to explore that fully yet. So this pretty much gets us to the end of the first half of what I wanted to cover with the ocean-going vessels. Wanted to get any questions you have on what we've presented here so far and issues that you see, and specifically looking at the schedule. What kind of time frame might be reasonable for the different options we've talked about here? For the electric infrastructure, obviously that's a major concern. What issues do you see there, or where can we get further information on that? the space for these systems, both land or water-based equipment, and some of the other points there. So Peg, Melissa, Monica, whoever is monitoring the chat and hand raising, do we have any questions or feedback at the moment?
So as a reminder, this is the time to raise your hand or type your question in the chat box. We have about 70 participants on the call right now, so I am hoping there are going to be a lot of hands raised and questions in the chat box.
Doug Snyder, you can unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We
Yes.
can.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hello, my name is Doug Schneider, and I'm with the World Shipping Council, or WSC. I thought it would be helpful to just make an introductory statement, and we certainly look forward to having further and close discussions with NJDEP on this effort. This is a very substantial one, but I thought I would start with just a statement describing who we are and what experience we've had in dealing with existing at-birth regulations for more than a decade in California. The World Shipping Council is a nonprofit trade association that represents the liner shipping industry, which is comprised of operators of container ships, roll-on, roll-off, or ro-ro vessels, as well as vehicle carriers. Our member lines operate vessels that carry import and export cargoes into and out of the ports and terminals that serve New Jersey and most major U.S. ports. Our WSC and our member lines have extensive experience of dealing with the at-berth electrification requirements in California. An effort of this magnitude will involve a multitude of challenges and complications, many of which you've highlighted already, not only for ocean carriers, but for the many terminals, ports, and utilities that would need to build out the necessary electrical infrastructure to be able to quickly and efficiently plug in vessels to shore power. The cost of port electrification would be significant and would require many years to construct the necessary infrastructure to quickly and efficiently connect arriving ships. Given the cost of the investments needed to support shoreside electrification for ships at berth, it's important to note that these substantial investments may be relatively short-lived in their utility. The World Shipping Council is working at the International Maritime Organization and elsewhere to develop technologies that will enable us to transition to low and zero carbon fuels, with a hope that zero carbon or zero emissions ships could begin to be introduced in the 2030s. If those ships are powered by zero emission fuels, the value of shoreside electrification and connections for large ships could soon become wasted investments. Experience in California demonstrates that any port electrification regime would also require clear regulatory obligations, not just on the vessels whose auxiliary emissions are to be controlled, but also on the ports and marine terminals at which those vessels call. Simply put, if a regulatory regime is to require a vessel to plug into shore power vaults, then the ports and marine terminals that the vessels call must also be required to build out the necessary shore power vaults and connections to the grid. Furthermore, and critically, certain classes of vessels that make infrequent and very short port calls and for which electrification may not be a cost-effective or operationally practicable control option, namely vehicle carriers and roll-on roll-off ships, must be considered for exemption from the requirements. While shore or barge-based emissions capture technologies that you described a few minutes ago may have a role as backups when electrical connections are unavailable, such technologies should not be considered a primary emissions control option, since they potentially disrupt loading and unloading operations, interfere with bunkering operations, pose safety and operational issues in adverse weather, are often unreliable, and generate high user fees. And in closing, I just wanted to say that our experience with existing at-berth regulations has demonstrated the vast array of investments, connection complications and obligations on both carriers and shoreside facilities that are necessary to build an effective at-berth program. In light of this experience, we believe that NJDEP should undertake an in-depth assessment of the necessary investments both on board vessels and on shore, how long those investments are likely to be viable in view of the changing suite of fuels and technologies likely to occur over the next 20 to 30 years, and the expected emissions benefits compared to the relevant costs. And as I said at the opening of this statement, we look forward to sharing what we've learned in California and working with NJDEP as you undertake this assessment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lee Kindberg, you can unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment.
This is Lee Kindberg with Maersk. Could I get a sound check? Can you hear me, Jeff?
Yes, I can. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. And my comments will be certainly aligned with World Shipping Council's, but because I'm on vacation because of the birth of a brand new grandchild, I'm going to be a little bit more informal today. Certainly, we would look forward to working with New Jersey to try to consider the practicalities of the various options for emissions reductions there in the area, and try to bring the knowledge that we've gained in over 10 years of managing some of these programs in California, which, by the way, I have managed all of that time. A few points that came up during your presentation. One is that the California Resources Board did approve their new regulation on August 27th. Mm-hmm. So just a couple of weeks ago. It is now going through the Administrative Procedures Act, or the Administrative Procedures process for implementation, starting the 1st of January, but implementation for most vessels, particularly container vessels, will start in 2023, and then 2025 for ro-ros, and I believe it's 2027 for tankers, but there will be some feasibility assessments and an interim report coming up in 2022, December of 2022. So still some things to be done before implementation in California, and several of us have been heavily involved in that, and certainly could share our experience with you on that. On the cost side, our experience has been that yes, you are talking about $1 million per vessel in terms of the retrofit, regardless of whether that vessel makes 8-hour calls or makes 5-day calls. Mm-hmm. And you made the very good point that there is a difference in the business model in California, particularly Southern California, compared to the East Coast of North America, where you typically have a very different vessel size and call pattern, multiple ports and so forth. I will also mention that if you're looking at something where you need to have shore power capability on both sides, the cost is more like $1.5 million or even more, rather than just $1 million per vessel. And because, again, of that business model difference, we did some quick back of the envelope estimations in terms of our 400 vessel calls year to date in your port. It's 127 different vessels year to date. So that would be on the order of $127 million to implement. Mm-hmm. So as you can see, we'd be talking, and almost none of them call California. So definitely a financial challenge. And then, as you pointed out too, California had an experience of, I think, about $5 million per berth in terms of installing the shoreside infrastructure, plus whatever cost there was for bringing the power to the port, mm-hmm. Which in some cases was very significant. And so $7 million sounds probably correct, since it's been a number of years since California had to make those investments. They are looking, by the way, at having to make some additional investments with this new every vessel, every call concept that their new system has embraced. Another point that I'd like to call to your attention with the California system is the administrative burden. Both of the old rule and the new proposed rule are very significant, very complex. It's almost like filing your income taxes. It's been pretty burdensome for particularly for the vessel operators. So that's something I'd like to get onto your radar map as we go forward with whatever strategies are selected to make improvements. And we do, by the way, support reducing vessel environmental impacts, but we want to be sure that the administrative burden doesn't overweigh the intent of improving that environmental impact. We also ought to think carefully about cost effectiveness because, as you point out, very different costs in New York, New Jersey, and very different vessel call patterns and lengths of calls. On the alternatives to shore power, the barge-based systems and land-based systems, there are currently in California only 2 barge-based systems, both of them in LA Long Beach. There's been no success in getting any others into any other ports, partly because of the business model differences. So those are certainly some things that would have to be looked at carefully. There is one experimental or prototype capture, a land-based capture system that has some promise and some real challenges, and it is enormous. So the space that you mentioned is absolutely something that would have to be looked at, particularly with different terminal designs that you would, marine terminal designs that you would have there in New Jersey. Rather than take up a lot of other time, again, we do support programs to reduce the environmental impacts, not just emissions reductions, but also water and so forth of our vessels, and certainly want to work with you. The programs that we find that are most effective are those that do align with, and at least not conflict with, the programs at IMO, national programs and programs in other leading places like California or China. So that alignment is something that I would very much like to call to your attention. And then let me just close with something that's in the middle of your slide here, talking about upgrades needed to utilize low sulfur fuels. And I'd like to ask for a clarification on that, but would like to point out that when California implemented their 0.1% MGO requirement or distillate fuel requirement, that was before the emissions control area was implemented around the entirety of the US and Canada. It was also before innovative programs like the Clean Vessel Initiative, which is a very innovative program that the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has run, that actually combines both vessel design and behavioral factors like speed to give incentives to vessels to actually slow down, reduce the emissions, reduce the fuel consumed. So those kinds of programs with that combination of factors actually rewards the newer, cleaner vessels, but also gives that incentive for the oldest, least capable vessel to also do behavioral changes that would impact the environment immediately. So the speed of implementation of something like that is something that is worth considering.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lee.
Lee, this is Peg Hannah. I'm so glad to hear your voice again after so many years. I just wanted to ask you for clarification, and I probably just didn't catch the whole thought. I thought you said at one point when we were talking about the cost to retrofit a vessel, you said over $1 million if it's required on both sides. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you think about how you might park your car, you can park your car with the driver's side towards the sidewalk or the passenger side towards the sidewalk. With the vessels, we call them port and starboard. And the shore power equipment cannot be moved from one side to the other with the current designs that all of the carriers have. So you're looking at basically another $500,000 to $750,000 to equip that second side.
So is it commonplace to have to equip both sides of the ship? Is that
it is not? It has not been up to now, but now if we start looking at a lot of and I haven't looked to see whether vessels typically dock port side 2 or starboard side 2 there at the ports in New Jersey. But what we found in LA and Long Beach was when the alliances came into being a number of years ago and vessels started calling terminals other than the ones they had been calling, there was a real challenge in terms of port side 2 versus starboard side 2. The terminal really does not want to work a vessel port side 2 if it's designed for starboard side 2, because they get it changes their traffic patterns, and so you get into all kinds of safety considerations and other considerations. But here's another one that relates to shore power. You probably spaced your connection points, those connection vaults, that are concreted into the berth. You probably spaced those based on a given vessel size, vessel spacing, and starboard or port side 2. A lot of the vessels have their shore power connections either at the stacks or accommodation or aftmost. So you're talking about having to have multiple connection points potentially, if you've got to be able to accommodate vessels parking in opposite directions. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
You are starting to see some vessels out there that do have the equipment on both sides, but again, it is an additional significant investment.
Very good. Thank you, and enjoy your grandchildren. Most
Thank
importantly.
you.
Yes. Monica, who's next?
Amy Goldsmith, you can unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment.
Thank you. So I'm Amy Goldsmith, State Director for Clean Water Action, and chair the Coalition for Healthy Ports, which consists of interfaith, environmental community, community groups, and faith leaders, and some labor as well. And my question has to do with capture and control. I had never heard until just now comments about the greenhouse gas levels going up. So I was sort of interested in hearing a little bit more about that. And the other is that I know that partly at our request, but partly because the Port Authority was already doing some channel studies, they did look at whether capture and control could be on a barge versus had to be on land, and they determined that because of safety reasons and reasons to get emergency equipment in, and the size of the ships, the growing size of the supersized Panamax ships, that that the Port Authority in New York and New Jersey would have to probably do a land-based strategy. So I just wanted to hear a little bit about that. And then the second part of my, I guess more of a comment, is that we have been, the Coalition for Healthy Ports has been somewhat more of an advocate of capture and control because of the need for flexibility. While it doesn't really remove all the emissions, and it does create some other issues, we know that, as was pointed out by Lee just now, it's a lot of ships and they all have different technologies on them. And what are you going to have different, shore power technologies on all different ships? And then some ships can plug in and some ships can't. We already know from the investment that was made on the Brooklyn side for the cruise ships, many of those ships can't plug in even though they're shore power, or it's so expensive that they can't do it. So, trying to be mindful of the costs and trying to get some relief. We've been, and also, as I mentioned this morning, concerns about climate resiliency. We're really concerned about, old infrastructure, and even if you upgrade it, is it going to be salted and destroyed by, the next climate storm. So, we're very concerned about that and want to be able to move expensive equipment out of harm's way. So, and I have heard about zero emission ships coming down the pipe. My son is actually in a maritime program at Texas A&M, so I hear all about this stuff. from their side, and he's getting ready to graduate, so he'll be on a ship one of these days. So I'm, you know, I'm aware of not wanting to invest in a technology that you're going to jump pretty soon. So I would like to hear a little bit more about that jump to the next technology that'll be more zero emission. I'm interested in this greenhouse gas question, and also how do we stay as flexible and resilient in a climate changing and port flooding world that we are certainly going to face in the future. So those are probably my three main questions.
Well, thank you, Amy. Let me see if I can tackle a couple of those. First, on the greenhouse gas emissions and the experience that California has, I can share with you, and we can make it available on the website as we post all of these materials in the next couple of days, because it's all public material that CARB has already released. As I had said, that table was the summary for the whole program statewide, but I can share with you the spreadsheets that it is based upon, and you'll see that for some ship types and in some port locations, I am presuming because of the mix of the technologies they have to use, the greenhouse gas emissions actually go up. As for the issues of water-based capture and control in the port, as I sort of alluded to in my conversation with Beth Ann Rooney and a few others from the port a week or so ago, yes, the waterside traffic issues are huge for those sorts of systems, and that's definitely apparent. We are hoping for our own education at some point to delve into more of the details of what moves where, both land and water side. And as to your last point regarding the zero carbon fueled ships that are coming out, we would welcome that information as well. We have heard vaguely of them, but as many more details as everyone on the call can help us find and point us towards would be greatly appreciated. Monica, who's next?
Jim Cobb, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Jim, you there? He's still muted at the moment.
Well, I don't have anyone else with their hand raised as of right now. We'll give it a few more minutes, and if not, we'll move on to the next section.
Okay. Well, while we're doing that, I will bring up sort of the last slide of this part of the presentation. Any comments that folks have, either that they've already made or that they think of later or haven't had the chance to fully put together, please email them to us at the address here, njairrulesmobile@dep.nj.gov. For this specific subtopic, please make sure you put in the subject line ocean-going vessels so we can parse things out and know how to address them. And the due date for those comments is October 14th. For those of you who are with us this morning, you'll notice this is different. And in the interim between this morning session and the afternoon, we heard your concerns about the late notice and the confused notice for these sessions. We asked our management, and they have already gotten back to us and said we can extend the times. So the time for all comments for everything we're talking about today, both morning and afternoon session, has been extended to October 14th. I believe there may have been changes to the sessions that were done last week, but I don't know for certain. You will all get, everyone who attended or was invited will get official email notification on that in the next day or so.
Jeff, this is Ken Ratzman. Just to clarify, all three sessions are extended by 2 weeks from whatever their original date was. So
okay.
all three sessions for the stationary source and the 2 days for the mobile. All of them have been extended for 2 weeks.
Okay, so then our date, which had been September 30th, as you see, is now October 14th. Last week's transportation sessions, which was September 24th, moves us to, I can't do the mod 7 math too quickly, but roughly September 8th or something like that.
Yeah, October 8th. Mm-hmm.
October 8th, excuse me. And Ken, I definitely can't do the math on what you did for stationary sources.
Comments were due today, so you get 2 more weeks, the 30th.
The 30th. Okay, very good. Monica has been handling
yes, we
some
have
logistics.
2 people waiting, so I'm going to call on Jim Cobb to unmute himself and ask his question or make his comment. Jim seems to be having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to call on John Nardi to ask his question or make his comment.
Hi, it's John. Can you hear me?
I can.
All right, thank you. So Jim and I are with the same organization, so I figured I'd bail him out with his technical issue.
Okay, good.
So we have a statement that we want to read. We really appreciate getting together, but the lack of notice that we had, I mean, I think if we had gotten the original notice from August 27th instead of 2 days ago, we could discuss a lot more details. But we put together a statement here on behalf of our members that we'd like to read. So, New York Shipping Association, for those who are not familiar with it, we're an association of ocean common carriers, marine terminals, and stevedore companies that operate in the Port of New York, New Jersey. And on behalf of its members, NYSA negotiates and administers labor contracts with the International Longshoremen's Association that covers the terms and conditions of employment for longshore and other related craft work. In addition, NYSA has been long active in important issues that impact port commerce and the port environment. And in its 65 years as an organization, NYSA, through close collaboration with other maritime and maritime-related organizations, has been an advocate for the interests of the port and the state of New Jersey, especially. NYSA has recently released its new economic impact study that reveals the port industry of New Jersey accounted for nearly $9.8 billion in federal, state, and local tax revenue. We supported over 428,000 jobs. It was responsible for $29.3 billion in personal income and $80.4 billion in business income. So, supported by nearly $2 billion in recent infrastructure investments, including raising the Bayonne Bridge, the Port of New York, New Jersey has become the second largest port in the United States. And our members are proud to support this economic engine, which has delivered prosperity to the state and region. Also, during the pandemic, NYSA members and their ILA workers have continued to work without a break to handle the cargo needed by consumers in this region, including personal protection equipment. So NYSA is also in the forefront of environmental issues impacting the port. It's has been a participant in the Clean Air Strategy Group facilitated by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey from its onset, as well as other environmental initiatives. And we're pleased to participate in today's stakeholders meeting set aside for ocean-going vessels and hovercraft, but notes that, again, we were not able to prepare the kind of detailed presentation necessary for the department's comprehensive review of the environmental initiatives implemented and being developed by its member companies. That said, NYSA supports the comments made in today's earlier session by the Port of New York and New Jersey Sustainable Terminal Services Agreement, which is the cargo handling session. And we also, want to say that we support the comments of the World Shipping Council. And NYSA will provide the department with additional information in the form of written comments. NYSA believes it's important to note that its ocean carrier members operate vessels in international commerce in ports all over the world. We caution the department in promulgating regulations that will discourage vessels from calling the port because of inconsistent requirements. Since the Port of New York and New Jersey competes for cargo with other ports throughout the nation, the state of New Jersey should not be placed in an unreasonable or unenviable restriction on these vessels without careful consideration of alternatives. This is particularly true because of the transportation of goods by water is the most environmentally friendly means of cargo transport. Therefore, care must be taken in assessing the viability of mitigation measures. That's not to say that the industry cannot be better. Improvement should always be considered, and that's why we're pleased to participate with the department in seeking creative solutions to ensure environmentally sustainable port operations in New Jersey. In addition, as noted by the marine terminal operators this morning, as the department considers regulations for the port sector is only a very small portion of the source of pollution attributed to the overall transportation sector. Thus, any regulation should be commensurate with the actual contribution of the port sector to the problem of CO2 and short-lived climate pollutions. Moreover, we're also concerned that with an approach in New Jersey that seeks to adopt CARB requirements for vessel operators, Port of New York, New Jersey is not geographically like the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach and should not be regulated as if it was. What we can learn from the example of the California model of addressing air quality issues, such a model should not be a blueprint for New Jersey. And I appreciate and understand that that's why we're having these discussions here and now. Along with our port partners, we've accomplished so much to attain the status as the second largest container port in the United States. Thus, it is imperative that we find an approach to air emissions regulations that fits this port and its vessel operations. In doing this, we can ensure the viability of the port and the environment for many years to come. And we look forward to detailed discussions where resources, technology, and infrastructure capabilities, as well as limitations, can be reviewed in detail. So thank you very much for letting NYSA make this statement.
John, thank you very much. And we certainly look forward to the further and more detailed comments and any additional information you folks can provide for us. It will be very helpful.
Just another point I'd like to make for those who don't know is we're the New York Shipping Association, but we're located in New Jersey. So when we were created back in the 50s,
you mean just like their football teams?
Exactly, but we're having a better year. Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Monica, anyone else?
I don't see anyone else, but if anybody is on the phone or that does not have the ability to raise their hand, if they want to unmute themselves and ask a question or make a comment, now would be the time to do that.
The nice thing is we're actually not done because we need to talk about Harborcraft. And we can certainly circle back to ocean-going vessels at the end at that time if someone thinks of something or isn't able to get through at the moment.
I think I don't see anyone, so okay. I think let's move on.
Let's move on, and as I said, we can circle back to ocean-going vessel-related topics. There are only a few more slides here to cover on the Harborcraft. So you've seen this pie chart before. We just pulled out a different pie piece. The Harborcraft, they are certainly the smallest or one of the smallest pieces of the picture, but they're not insignificant. And while they may be smaller from a pollution standpoint, they may have some better opportunities and more cost-effective opportunities than the ocean-going vessels we've just been talking about because they live here. They're in the port pretty much their entire lives, or certainly a vast majority of it, unlike the ocean-going vessels, which obviously come and go, and many of them may only see us a couple times a year. Again, contributions in greenhouse gases for the Harborcraft is also, again, pretty small, but they are, as I said, local here and with us basically 24/7. Some information on a Harborcraft inventory, and thanks again to our friends at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey who are helping us locate this and make sense of some of what we were finding in more general sources. There are basically three types of Harborcraft that we are looking at: tugs, tows, and ferries. And I personally have to say I got a great education here and did not fully understand the difference between the two before. But the tugboats are what we all probably thought of as little kids pushing the large ships into their berth and helping them guide around. Indications are there are between 40 or 50 of them operating in the harbor area, and each ship that comes in will need the assistance of 2 to 4 of those tugs, depending on its size, where it's going, and its own inherent maneuverability. There are 2 major owner-operators that run the tug fleet, and the impression we got is that they are generally slightly newer and slightly larger than the other harbor craft that we're looking at. The towboats, of which there are several hundred in the harbor, move barges around for fueling, for lightering, for trash collection, for delivery of other goods and materials, food for the crew on the ships, things of that nature. They usually work alone. There are a couple of dozen different owner-operators managing this collective fleet of towboats, and they generally tend to be older and smaller than their tugboat cousins. And then finally, there are the ferries, which we're all pretty familiar with, passenger ferries. Several of those have actually already been repowered through some grant programs that we've been working on within the Bureau of Mobile Sources here at DEP. And I believe 1 or 2 more may have been part of that list that Peg mentioned earlier of applications for more Volkswagen money. I'm not positive of that. So currently, again, looking to CARB and seeing what they're doing. They have some regulations that were adopted in 2007, amended slightly in 2010, applying to tugs, tows, and ferries. They require those vessels to use ultra-low sulfur diesel, ULSD. Newer boats must have be equipped with the most recent tier engine available at their time of construction. And any boats undergoing an engine replacement or repower must use a tier 2 or 3, or in some specific circumstances, a tier 4 as their replacement. As with all of these rules, CARB is currently contemplating and developing some potential amendments and additional features to these regulations. These would potentially include pilot boats, research vessels, all tank barges, and they specifically added in charter fishing and excluded commercial fishing, if I remember correctly. They would have improved engine requirements for repowers, tier 3 and 4 only. They would no longer allow tier 2 and would require tier 4 with DPF in some applications. There's also the possibility of hybrid or zero emissions power systems for new boats. And based on what we heard a few minutes ago about some of the zero emission, zero carbon options being looked at for ocean-going vessels in the next 10 to 15 years, I'm thinking out loud here that this may be some of the same technologies or the same systems. Phase-in of these new rules, CARB is thinking about starting in 2023. Our potential strategies would base off of some of those same things that CARB is looking at. Improved fuel quality, primarily, of course, reducing sulfur content. It goes a long way to reducing various particulates. Engine replacement on in-use vessels, in-use boats. And as I mentioned, we've been involved in some of those repowers, at least for some ferries. And there have been some, at least preliminary discussions on a couple of tugboats, I believe, as well. Requirements for the newest tier 3, tier 4 propulsion systems for the new boats that are coming in, and possible exhaust after treatment retrofits is another possibility. So that's sort of a summary of where we see possibilities with Harborcraft. And again, ready to open things back up to questions here about the material we've presented and some of the direction we're going. And specifically issue-wise, again, what lead times might be needed for some of these different options, implementation issues, and specifically, are there any reduction approaches that we've outlined here that might be better for tugs versus tows or vice versa? Are there operations different enough that they might warrant a different approach? So with that, if anyone has any questions, insights, additional information they would like to share with us, now's the time to put it in the chat window or raise your hand and Monica will call on you.
Okay, Edward Kelly, you can unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment.
Ed, are you there?
Yes, I'm unmuted now. I can be heard, I trust.
Yes, you can. Please go ahead.
Again, my apologies. We have not. I'm with the Maritime Association of the Port of New York and New Jersey. Our representation is of paid corporate memberships and individual memberships, embracing virtually all aspects of the maritime industry. We got very late notice of this meeting. Among our representation are tugboat operators, tug carriers, hovercraft, ferries, etc. And I would say that I don't think that the notice for this meeting has gone out to that group as well as it might have, and that there are two organizations I would point toward: American Waterways Operators, which is a national association representing all sorts of tug, tow, and barging operations throughout the United States. And on a very localized basis, we have a Towboat and Harbor Carriers Association, which works under the auspice of Maritime Association, representing all of them. Also, as Maritime Association Port of New York, we have an underlying passenger vessel subcommittee, which represents all sorts of passenger ferries here in the port area. So we would be willing to get a venue to get those groups engaged in this discussion, because it would seem that they are most, purposely driven toward responding to the issues you have at hand. Unfortunately, I have to get off this call to join a New York City Mayor Advisory Board call in just a couple minutes. But whoever would like to, that can reach out to us, we can put you in touch with those parties. I did a quick run of the attendees at this meeting, and I did not notice representatives from any of those groups on this call, and I think they're groups you ought to hear from.
Absolutely. Ed, someone will definitely follow up on it. Thank you very much.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay,
Monica, who's next?
Yeah, Amy Goldsmith, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, thank you.
Hello, Amy.
Hi, I feel like I'm a returned guest here. So I remember, now this is kind of going a little bit back into the Wayback Machine here, but I remember when Lisa Jackson was newly appointed to be the head of the EPA. And at that time, she came and did a big press event at the port about an agreement that was made with ferries and tugs and some upgrades that were going to be done in order to reduce emissions. And in part, it was a trade-off between dredging, which was going to increase emissions, and trying to lower emissions through the ferries and the tugs. And I may not be using all the right terminology as I'm being educated too, as Jeff is on harborcraft, tows, and the different lingo here.
The event you mentioned sounds familiar.
Yes. Okay. We've all been around for a while. So and then I remember just a couple of years ago that the EPA kind of realized, and maybe I think it was when the Obama administration was still around, realized that the kind of the bang for the effort, not because the tugs did the wrong thing or anything, but that we all thought some of these older vessels were going to retire sooner. And you mentioned that the tows are older, smaller, dirtier. And the EPA kind of realized, oh my gosh, you know, we thought these vessels were going to disappear sooner, but yet they're going to go on for another 20 years or whatever it is, because you keep, you know, redoing the engines and the like. And I'm just wondering if there's any new data or new initiatives around that. And then also, just for my own clarification, when I go to the Port of Newark, there's a company that operates, I don't know, is it Harborcraft or tows or both? Can you describe what those vessels are that are sitting at that terminal, so that I just kind of get a better frame of reference? Or maybe there's somebody in the industry who would know the answer to that.
I certainly do not, and wouldn't hazard a guess. I've been to the port a few times, but not enough. But there may be someone on the call who might know. If not now, maybe could connect with you and you know, figure out exactly which vessels you're looking at first, and then, you know, provide information.
I know there's a whole nother set that are basically are docked in Staten Island, but I was just wondering about this one.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any kind of, what was the progress made around that? I know there was some funding and incentives, you know, to help people switch, but it wasn't that many vessels, as I recall.
Yeah, I have a recollection personally of what you were talking about, Amy, but I was not directly involved at all. I do not actually know if, Melissa, if you're still on, you might have been more involved or might remember what Amy's referring to here. So I don't know any specifics about that program. Oh, there's Melissa.
Yeah, I don't recall what Amy is referring to. There was another point, Amy, that you made, that during the Obama administration, there were some entities looking into marine vessels. Going back, I know the Environmental Defense Fund and the Diesel Technology Forum looked into that issue and did conclude that marine vessels do operate a lot longer than what EPA initially thought was their useful life. And I believe they did a paper on that. For New Jersey, we have had some voluntary projects. We did repower a passenger ferry using EPA funds, and that was very successful. There's a lot of emissions to be had from a marine repower. I believe that there was also some marine repowers that were done on the New York side. So we will continue to move forward with projects like that with federal funding. Unfortunately, there are some administrative issues for us that prohibit us from moving forward to money that was already authorized to us. But we do see that there's considerable benefits from repowering the marine engines, because they do last for a long time. A lot of them are tier 0 or tier 1. And so even if we can just get them to tier 3, tier 4, it's a big emissions benefit.
Yeah, and I totally recognize that. And is the challenge around the Buy America waiver that I know the Port Authority has not been able to get around on some other you know, diesel reduction measures?
Yes,
is that
it
the
is.
Same issue?
It is, and we have a lot of money tied up in that issue, unfortunately.
Well, hopefully there'll be a brand new day next year, so everybody should go out and vote.
And one of the other benefits to those projects that Melissa was just talking about is, because the engines that are being replaced in many cases are so old, not only do you get the large criteria pollutant benefits, NOx, PM, etc., but the engines also in many cases are significantly more efficient. So the operator realizes a fuel savings, which of course from our perspective means a greenhouse gas reduction. So they can be quite promising in that regard as well. Monica, who do we have next?
I don't have anyone with their hand raised at the moment.
I thought I saw Ed pop his hand up again. I was thinking perhaps to answer
Yes,
there he is. Yep.
Is. Edward, you can unmute yourself.
I unmuted. Amy, if you'd like to reach out to me and explain where you're seeing, we can explain what types of craft they are. Harbor craft are many, many different types, tugs, barges, tugs, tows. There actually is an objection to saying that tows are old or none. Some of the most modern tugs in the harbor are associated with fuel transport and articulated tug barges. So there are construction barges, which also you have, tugs to move them into position for marine construction. So there's a for dredging, there's a phenomenal variety of vessels here. And I would point out that virtually all tugs and hovercraft are operating in the harbors with reduced sulfur fuel as a requirement. And yes, there is a Jones Act requirement that these vessels are American built and crewed. So there can be some unique restrictions compared to some of the international vessels. And again, I apologize, but I've got a mayor's maritime advisory board that I've got to get to. So I'll jump off. But if you reach out to me and tell me what you saw or where you saw it, we can tell you who that would be. And I would recommend that we will arrange for follow-up with American Waterways operators, with the Towboat and Harbor Carriers Association, and our passenger vessel, which is all the ferries in the harbor. So there's a lot of information we can engage in. I'm certain those groups will be very happy to engage in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Ed. I appreciate that.
Monica, anyone else?
I don't see anyone at the moment, but if anybody that cannot raise their hand or is on the phone that has any questions or comments, now would be the time to unmute yourself and ask that question.
And this would include, going back to the initial part of this conversation on the ocean-going vessels. Reminder again, if you have any comments or further technical information, we would love to take a look at it. Please send it to us. NJ Air Rules Mobile at dep.nj.gov. And for this subcategory, please put Harborcraft in the subject line. And once again, we have extended the comment deadline to October 14th for all of our discussions today.
Will you be putting all the new dates up or circulating to everybody who's been invited in the past? Because I couldn't get it all. But is everything basically shifting 2 weeks? So
everything is shifting 2 weeks.
Okay.
The website will be updated either later today or tomorrow with those new deadlines. Correct, Monica?
Yes.
Okay. And my understanding is, in addition, an email will go out to all of the participants formally announcing the change, the extension.
Thank you for making that happen. That was great.
You guys just were lucky. I had a chance during my lunch break to go back in and edit the presentation so it reflected the new dates.
Could I jump in and ask what are the next steps?
Yes, Lee, I was going to call on you next, but you can go ahead and speak now.
Well, that was my question. I must admit, I have not been involved in this process to this point, and so was wondering what we're looking at in terms of next steps, timeframes, support needs, those kinds of things.
Well, certainly our first step is going to be receiving, reviewing, digesting the comments, the material, the feedback that everyone is providing us with. particularly technical information, and then reaching out to some of the folks who, either due to the technical glitches which we got plagued with for today's sessions, as well as just our steep learning curve, you know, folks we either hadn't thought of or hadn't known to even think of, to get further information. The specific timeline, Monica, Melissa, one of you have that in front of you? I saw it come through at one point today, but don't see it.
Yes, so this is Melissa. I think, so what we're going to do is we're going to continue to review all the comments that come in. Now everything will be shifted 2 weeks to give everybody more time. We'll review them, see where we are. You know, initially we wanted to propose some rules this spring, which means we would be actively taking part in rule writing. Again, like Peg had mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, we're not going to rush to get rules out just to get them out. They have to make sense. We need to understand, you know, all of the issues. We've gone over a lot today and last week when we reviewed the truck rules. So we need to look at all the comments. We need to look at the issues. We need to look at what CARB is doing, as they haven't decided on some of these issues. We have to look at legal issues. So right now, there's not a plan to say, okay, we are moving forward with a cargo handling rule. And it just is a matter of what it's going to say. We want to ensure what we move forward with makes sense. And that's where all of your comments will be really important for us to read, digest, and to process. And there might be further dialogue that needs to happen after today. Any more questions? Comments? Any clarification on what Jeff might have said? Christine, did you want to add anything?
I just wanted to say that there was some conversation in the chat about our sister programs, NJPACT, Stakeholdering. So the resiliency side of NJPACT is also stakeholdering. Those meetings, the dates of those meetings are on the NJPACT website. But the invitations to those and the links for those went out to the invitees. So if it's something that you are interested in based on the topic areas that are being covered, recognizing that this is not about emissions, but more about the impacts of climate on the infrastructure, then please send us an email and we will get you to the right people in land use.
Monica, still no further hands raised or anything?
Everything is quiet.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone once again for joining us. Your input and feedback and efforts to educate us and help us understand all this as we all work together on these issues is greatly appreciated. And looking at my watch, it looks like we're giving you some time back in your afternoon. So please use it safely and wisely.